Good afternoon, and this is Labor Day, and you all are not in school for obvious reasons. I am, however, going to record this, and hopefully you'll get it by tomorrow morning, and we can use it for this week. Apparently, last week got so crazy politically that I literally could not find a way to talk to you all about the concept of theory and theories. I just went sort of a little bit nuts in my brain trying to work out how to talk about it. And ultimately, what I've come up with is I'm just going to blur the history of political communication with that conversation about theory because it's almost impossible to separate the two, really. And secondly, because things are kind of nuts right now. One of the things you're going to notice as we go through this semester, remember how I said, well, there's an election coming, so that's always good because we can organize our course around that. Well, with everything that's going on, it's probably important to talk about the current events that are happening and about the communication that goes along with it so that we can understand better the sort of exceptional, or the word that everybody uses is unprecedented, political sort of landscape that we're living in. So it's unfortunate that I can't find a way to present theory to you in a way that's going to be useful. So let's first talk about theory generally. It is a set of principles or a set of ideas or concepts that are used and applied to a practical skill or a practical art, and it helps explain that practice. So, for example, a theory of education is a set of principles or guidelines that say, here's how we want to go about learning to teach or teaching. And then when we actually teach, we put those theories, concepts, ideas, we put those ideas together and put them into practice. And then we're no longer working from theory, we're working practically, right? And so a lot of people say about PhDs and college professors and other elitists, I guess, not my favorite word, but they say that all we do is sit around and theorize about things, and we don't actually do anything practical. We teach you all theory, but we don't teach you anything practical from that theory. It is my hope that instead we view theory a little bit differently. And the way that generally I view theory in political communication is to say, okay, what do we expect will happen? Now, there's a problem with that. Several problems, actually. First of all, political communication studies generally occur in hindsight. There's not a way to predict what people are going to say or do, at least not anymore. There was a time when we could see a set of expectations for a political communication act. For example, I could have predicted some elements of an inaugural address or of an address to Congress. I could have predicted some elements of requesting money for a war from Congress. I could have helped you understand the models for communication that are born out of campaign studies. For example, how a political ad should work, what a political ad is, etc. And we will talk about those things, but they're not as predictable as they used to be. In fact, I'm not really sure that we could study the last, 6 to 8 years without having to stretch ourselves beyond even those models that were working up until about 2016. Now, that's not a blame game. It may not necessarily even be a bad thing, honestly. Sometimes everything in the world needs a little bit of a hard reset, and theory is probably one of those places where that's true. However, some theoretical principles still apply, very much so, and it is always going to be true that political communication studies are hindsight studies. We don't predict generally what's going to happen, and that's always going to be true. Why? Well, because the act that we're looking at, the political act of speech, is never completely understood prior to it being an act. So we can sort of guess at what some candidates or presidents or congresspeople might say. We can guess based on our past history, but we can never predict what they're going to say. We can suggest what they should say, but we can't predict what they actually will say. Remember, human beings are the number one most uncontrollable variable to be studied. the human brain has a tendency to do things way off of the reservation. So much like when we study human beings' reactions to certain things and we get sort of a mix of those things and a blend of those things based on averages from testing, from surveys, etc., the same thing in political communication. We sort of have to feel it out before we can really know what's going on. So keep that in mind as we talk about the history of political communication and how it's grown. Sort of similar to political sciences in a lot of ways, which attempts to predict behavior, whereas we tend to try to predict, if we're going to predict, what someone might say. And that's almost impossible. When you're dealing with one human being, you can't deal with averages. That is the lesson that we learned in 2016. So, is there a such thing as a political communication theory? I'm going to go ahead and say no right now. Not one that works really well. Not one that's an overarching, encompassing political communication theory. Civility does not always work. Anger does not always work. Emotional appeals do not always work. There are certain things that we can know and theorize about because they're consistent or they've been consistent for so long. Things like there will be negative political ads. Negative political ads tend to garner more attention and even though we don't like them, we tend to learn more from them as voters. Things like that are probably not going to change, not too much at least, unless somebody really invents a new way to communicate. However, most of the stuff that we look at, let's say, for example, how people are going to vote, what language should be used in a particular situation, it's so specific to the rhetorical situation of the time that it's hard to theorize about it. And that's also why the history of political communication is very, very clear, chronologically clear and predictable. And I'm going to talk about that right now. The number one thing that defines political communication has always been, obviously, technology. Political communication has been studied since about 400 BCE, as I've said before. Aristotle sort of talked about the theory of communication between a government and its people. At the time, he was talking about like sort of the Senate and the citizenry. And obviously, he was talking about a different set of parameters for both of those things. But we use those principles today, that the job of a rhetorician is to explain the government to the people. That's sort of the job of a rhetorician. The job of the rhetoric is to explain what those words mean when our government officials say them. Political communication, then, is usually rhetoric. Whenever we're talking about studying political communication, we're talking about the communication act, and we're talking about all the things that go into that act, but we're talking about them in a very specific context. Now, it may not sound specific to say the political context, except that every single political communication right now is in an entirely different context. Okay. Now, is it true that we have the same media that we had 6 years ago? Not really. So we're going to see massive changes based on technology and the development of technology and how that impacts political communication in order to understand the history of political communication. Before I get into that, I want to make it very clear. The idea as a course of study of political communication is not something that you really find prior to about the 1960s. Of course, communication itself was not a separate course of study until about the 1960s, when we separated from English departments to study speech rather than the written language. Same thing for political communication. It was when we started studying speech, but we stopped trying to predict behavior. Political science used to be the field where you would study these types of things, the political speeches and so on. But now they're in our purview of communication, and they generally tend to study behavior, the scientific side of things, the quantitative repetition of study in order to see how people react or respond in a realistic setting. All right. We don't generally do that. We are more interested in how people respond to speeches, how those speeches are created, what the speeches are saying, what could be expected or predictable, if anything, and so on. We're not usually interested in the behavioral practices on a mass scale. All right, hopefully that is clear to you. The study of political communication is not one that was its own field or course of study until about the 1960s, or a little later, after speech and literature split from each other. All right, hopefully that helps. Now, because it's so young in nature, there's a lot of theorizing that came out in the 1970s. You had the theory of genres, the rhetorical act. You had people talking about a functional approach to political advertising, political speeches, etc. You had people who were studying the impact of technology on voter impressions of candidates and campaigns. That was all happening from the 1970s on. All right. So let's start at the very beginning, 400 or so BCE, with Aristotle and Plato debating whether a democracy of any kind or I think he really wanted, what was it? It's a type of monarchy that he was interested in. He was interested in the philosopher king. Okay. Somebody who was able to pontificate and talk about the philosophy of life and finding the good in life as the leader of, and really a king. Monarchy or democracy? Well, according to Aristotle, in a monarchy, you don't really need the study of political communication. The king says something, the monarch says something, and it's passed down, and the citizens do it, and that's that. But in a democracy, because there's sort of a decentralization of power, and the people are supposed to be the ones who are telling the government what to do, there is a greater need for more people to understand what the government is so that they may participate in it fully. So when we talk about political communication and rhetoric being linked to democracy from 400 BCE, that is not a joke. That is exactly where the study began. Now, not very many people are going to tell you, oh, Aristotle was a political communication scholar. That's certainly not that's certainly not what we're talking about. He was not a part of the field. He did not study that field. That field was not a field. It was not a field way back. It was not a field prior to my birth. Okay. Well, actually a little bit prior, but not much. All right. So let's talk about then how it progressed over time and when the big changes came. So the first big change in understanding how political communication worked was when we moved from the Roman Republic, a democracy, to the Roman Empire, autocracy, or a monarchy-like. Okay, it was an empire. So you had one person in charge, and that was it. So when we moved from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, what you had was a great need for rhetoric that plummeted into no need for rhetoric at all whatsoever. And that really left some turmoil. And if you take the rhetoric class, you'll know what that turmoil was, okay? Very exciting time for me. I love reading about the Roman Empire, the switch from the Republic to the Empire. It took a long time. It's not like overnight. But we saw the slow degradation of rhetoric and the use of political communication by the citizens just plummet and go away, eventually being erased because we then move into the medieval period. And that's like 1600 years. But in the first part of the medieval period, what we do know is that that sort of idea of an empire became the Holy Roman Empire, which of course was the church. And the church being, in this case, the Catholic Church in Western thought, the Pope was in charge of everything and dictated to the kings or dictated to rulers in the Western Hemisphere about how things should be, because God told the Pope and the Pope told everyone else, and that's how the countries were run. Now, that's a very simplified way of putting it. I'm not here for a history lesson, though. So essentially, the Pope was at the top, or the church, I should say, was at the top, and they were sending directives down to, the rest of us. And so it's sort of still a very hierarchical, autocratic structure of, there's not a lot of need for rhetoric. There's not a lot of need for explaining to people what's going on. There's not a lot of need for the people to be participating in what's going on. It's just not there. Now, in the later medieval period, we're looking, I believe, at the 15th century, 16th, somewhere in there, when the printing press came along. Now, this is really the first great technological advance that's made that changes the way that political thought is shared. The printing press allowed for the mass production of essays and of, obviously, the Bible. That was the first one, and allowed for that mass production to occur. And as those presses became bigger and faster over, decades, more work could be put out there, and more ideas could be shared, and more thoughts could be competing in, that marketplace of ideas of Western political thought. And that's exactly what happened. We had people who challenged the church as a political leader. We had groups and organizations that challenged what kind of power systems we all wanted. How people wanted to be ruled was generally based on how much participation they were allowed to have. And of course, comparatively to the Eastern Hemisphere, where for the most part in those cultures, there was no need for rhetoric ever in that history because they did not have democracies. So centralized powers such as empires and the church and dictators and autocrats and so on, there is no need for the study of political communication. It's just not necessary. There's no need for the study of rhetoric. Not necessary. Because one person speaks and everybody else falls in line. We in democracies tend to not like that very much. The printing press, when it was, rich people, scholars, people, monks working on the Bible, and so on, who were allowed to write and produce these essays and these works, then we started to get, prints of works that were done before, certainly, but also new ideas and essays and so on. So as those essays and ideas increased in number, and the public began to get access to it, we saw real changes in the discussion of the philosophy behind political structures and what amount of power people wanted their governments to have. You see, this is really where the people started to get more power vis-a-vis a medium. Okay, so the media gives the people the power to, sort of tell the government what they want. So it's important for us to understand that whenever we talk about the media as I don't know how to put that. The media as sort of controlling what it is that we think or what it is that we're trying to say to the government, then we have to understand the impact of that. The first thing that every government does, if they want to move from a democratic-like system to more autocracy or more the dictatorship or be what it may, the first thing they do is shut down the media. Okay, you shut down the media. You don't allow people to use their iPhones anymore for the most part. You certainly block television or radio or broadcast or so on and so forth. So I just had to Wikipedia the printing press to give you all the proper, 1440. Excellent. I've not lost my entirety of my history brain, although yeah, because that would be the 15th century, right? So very good. All right, so I don't want to mislead you. So as the printing press became more popular and as more people started writing and as scholars were being developed in school systems, we started to have more writings about philosophically about political sort of structures and how they should work and political philosophy, to be honest with you. And you might be thinking, well, when did that happen? Well, take anybody you want. John Locke, the idea of a social contract, the Magna Carta, he actually influenced the Magna Carta greatly, and that's what our Constitution is based off of in a lot of ways. It's the Declaration of Independence. It's based on that Magna Carta, I believe. So we use those old, like truly old government negotiations in order to understand what we wanted to do. So we also had Hobbes. We also had religious leaders such as, I'm trying to think of the 95 Theses. Why can't I remember the name of that? It's like a whole, isn't that the Methodists, I believe? It'll come to me. I'm old. I'm telling you, my brain is like a sieve. So when we have that type of change, it impacts greatly how people work. After the printing press, we have to jump a little bit ahead, and not as far ahead as you would think, but a little further ahead to the telegraph, the telephone, the radio. When those came into the population, it was much later because while they might have been invented, not a lot of people had access to them, just like the printing press. But when people got access to specifically the radio, and suddenly there was this mass communication that could occur all at once, and people could learn from radio shows, they could be entertained by radio shows, or by people who were speaking on the radio, and everyone who could hear them all at the same time. You didn't have to write anything, you didn't have to print it, you didn't have to wait. So the radio made a great impact on political communication, specifically with FDR. I think we're all pretty familiar with the fireside chats, where he used to sit next to the fire and talk to people over the radio. And they felt like the president of the United States was in their home with them, in their living room, as they all sat around the radio listening to what he had to say. That greatly impacted the way that the citizens communicated with the government, but specifically this time, how the government was communicating with the people, letting them know, informing them of what he was thinking, what he wanted to do, what plans he had. And this was particularly important during his tenure because, as you know, he was a president for a very long time through a lot of major changes in our political system, but in our economic system too. From there, we moved from radio to television. And a lot of people think, well, that's not a big leap. I mean, sometimes I put my TV on, I walk away, and I'm just listening to Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the background. I'm just kidding. I moved on from that a long time ago. It's now supernatural still. It's never going to be not supernatural, I think. So we put these like movies or television shows or whatever in the background, and it functions basically like a radio. Maybe we put music videos on. I don't know about you, but I walk away from my TV a lot more often than I sit and watch that television. So, but there is a huge difference because when people were able to see what these leaders looked like, there was a sudden great change in the way that we perceived our leadership, particularly even the first photo of a president, which I believe was actually FDR as well. I'd have to check myself on that. But I believe that the first presidential photo that sort of a mass audience was privy to was Roosevelt. If it wasn't, it was someone else. I apologize, but the impact was the same. People were able to say, not only do I know what this person sounds like, but now I know what they look like. I know how they function. But the television didn't do just what the photograph did of, I know what they look like now. The television put their facial expressions on there. It allowed people to feel closer to their government officials. Okay, like he's talking to me. And we're going to get into why that's important in just a few minutes. Actually, you may see where this is going. He's talking to me. He's telling me what's happening. So my family is sitting around and we're watching on TV as they make eye contact with the camera. It feels like they're looking right at us as they speak. And of course, you may or may not know that this became a major political impact in 1960. And of course, that's because Nixon and Kennedy were debating each other, and people talked about the impact of Kennedy's good looks versus Nixon's older look. And, you know, the look of someone, their video style, as we used to call it in the late 90s and early aughts, that style that they had greatly impacted whether people saw them as credible or not. So a lot of times in debates, when we look at debates or we look at presidential campaign speeches or even congressional, we look at the person and wonder if they are credible or not. We utilize our visual as well as our audio auditory, I should say, in order for us to know whether or not they seem credible. Now, personally, I've watched those black and white debates between Kennedy and Nixon. I'm a former debater. I think that's the only way I can follow it because they asked, I don't know how to put this, I'm not going to be gentle. They asked real questions about economic policy, foreign policy, domestic policies in very specific ways. And of course, the wars and where we were going to move forward with whether or not America or the United States should be a little bit more forthcoming in our colonialism or whether we should shut ourselves off from that. These were important debates. They weren't the trolling or I'm going to say silliness of some of the more recent debates that we've seen on television. And I'm not just including presidential debates, but also congressional debates. Some of them have just gotten to the point where it's like, this tells me nothing about whether or not this person can lead my country or my state or my district. It doesn't tell me if they're going to represent me. It just tells me how silly and childlike we can be sometimes. So that really went the way of the buffalo, as my grandfather used to say, in the sense that we took a turn for the worse with our television coverage and how it impacts the political reception of messages by the citizens. So, okay, you know where I'm going with this, right? Because that was 1960. They did not have another debate until 1972. So there were debates in 1960, and then there were not debates until 1972. Now, were there people studying these debates and predicting who would win or talking about who did win in their minds? Yes, absolutely. And were studies done to say, hey, American people, who do you think won this debate? If there's a winner. And what's interesting about that is that, you know, I have a lot of people come to me and tell me, oh, well, there was the one study that said that Kennedy won, and but that was, you know, that Kennedy won hands down. There were others that said Nixon won hands down. There were a few studies that suggested that people who watched it on TV thought that Kennedy won, and people who listened on the radio thought that Nixon won. That is actually false. That has been proven at least questionable because the way that they went about getting that information was truly problematic. There's no reason to say that that is an accurate description of what happened at all. Of course, you know, Kennedy won. But they were also violating a fairness doctrine, Section 315 at the time, and they couldn't figure out how to fix that until 1972 when Congress said, we're just going to suspend that section of FCC code and we're going to allow these debates to happen. And ever since, that's sort of what's happened. Okay. That equal time clause that says, you know, sort of, I called it the fairness doctrine. I do that a lot. I don't know why, but it's the equal time clause. It says that if you give one political perspective time on air, then you have to give equal time to the other political perspectives. And of course, in 1992, we saw that explode into 3, and that caused some chaos. So from 1972 to 1992, there were 3 debates every single presidential election between the presidential candidates, 1 debate between the vice presidents. And that changed later. I believe that we started going down to 2 presidential debates and 1 VP debate. We've done a few things in between 1972 and 1992, but for the most part, the format, the people who were asking the question, who were journalists, by the way, not TV personalities, but actual journalists who were asking the questions that they believed that people wanted to read the answers to or hear about more, were asking the questions. And for 20 years, that's the way that went. And it was nice and clean, in the sense that we could really decide who we thought won and who we thought lost. It really did help people vote. That's what you'll find out, is that a lot of people said, well, the political ads are, what they are, but really where I make my decision is in the presidential debates, because I get to know what the candidate's like. Now, in 1992, apparently we decided that was not good enough. And we had 3 candidates on the ballot, because at the time, the way the numbers worked out, Ross Perot, who was from, it's an independent party. It's not the Libertarian Party. It is a party, I think, that still exists, though, but I don't remember which party it was. He got enough votes in the primaries to be able to be on stage. And so we had Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Ross Perot. And that really messes with the timing of a debate and so on. But one of the things they did was in St. Louis that year, the League of Women Voters shifted the structure and made it a town hall debate where the candidates were sitting in chairs on the stage and would get up to answer the questions. And it wreaked a little bit of havoc. I don't know if that's because there were 3 or if that was because of the structure and it was new. It was kind of interesting, though, because it did feel like if you were in the audience and, the candidate came up and they looked at you and you asked that question, even if you were watching on TV, you think, oh, there's a more personal interaction that I can base my feelings about the candidate on, the feelings I have about the candidate. Very little was learned about their policy positions. And I know everybody's thinking, well, that's boring anyway. But some people are still making decisions for president and for congressional seats and so on policy more than they are on personality. Okay, the image versus issue question when it comes to watching presidential campaigns, congressional campaigns, whether that's political ads, debates, speeches, or so on. The question of image versus issue, and do they line up, and are they credible? So in 1992, there was a split vote with the Republicans because some Republicans decided that they wanted to go the way of Ross Perot. Well, that split the vote. And so for the first time in our nation's history, and I think the last, we had a president elected by less than 50% of the vote of the country. And this only makes sense because if you have the vote going 3 different ways, then the person you elect can't have over, well, they could, but probably won't have over 50% of the American voter. So that's exactly what happened. And a lot of people will tell you, Bill Clinton, he won the election because they split the vote of the Republicans. And I 100% agree with that, at least in part to explain why George H.W. Bush, who should have had this victory landslide, ended up losing that election. There was just no reason for it. It was uncalled for in the sense of if you're looking at something politically, from a theoretical standpoint of the time, the predictive models of why George H.W. Bush should have won were all saying he should have had a landslide victory. Number 1, coming off of a war. Number 2, the economy was in good shape at the time. Number 3, he was only criticized for things like being out of touch and such, but he had CIA experience, obviously. He ran it. He had government experience for many, many years. He had a lot of money. and there should have been no question that he was going to win. The split of the Republican vote between him and Ross Perot impacts that greatly. Yes, Bill Clinton's team ran a fantastic campaign. I'm not going to lie about that. That is true, but he still didn't get over 50% of the vote. And there's a good reason for that. It was that more than likely, had Ross Perot not run, George H.W. Bush probably would have won that election. I'm going to say probably. It's not a guarantee. But sort of like the elections that are coming up this midterm, there is no reason why the polls should be telling you what they are. The Republicans should be sweeping the Democrats left and right. The reason for that is because no matter what your political position is, you have to sort of step back and really look and say, okay, why is this happening the way that it's happening? Because quite frankly, I feel a little bit bad for a lot of Republicans right now who were expecting a landslide victory and sweeping several seats in Congress. I feel a little bit bad for them because the reason that they're not has everything to do with their party splitting again between those who support Trump and those who do not. And the people who support Trump supporters and the people who do not. So you have that split again in the Republican Party, which I'm not going to predict this, I'm just going to say may impact whether or not the Democrats are able to hold their power in the executive and the congressional branch. Keep in mind that because of the balance of powers, if you keep power in the executive and the congressional legislative branches, then you don't ever need to worry about what's going on in the judicial branch. Not really, because they can't make laws in the legislative or in the judicial branch. Only the legislative and the executive can. And that's an important thing for all of us to remember, because while some people are saying, well, we still have the Supreme Court, our conservative ideals will be held by them. Probably not. One thing I'm learning, talking to people and doing surveys and reading what I've been reading, is that Republicans are more and more confused about who they should support and who they shouldn't. And I completely understand that. We've had some I'm not going to, okay, I'm going to say wackadoos in the Democratic Party as well, of course. And I'm always afraid they're going to fracture. And when they fracture, if both the Democrat and the Republican parties are fractured within themselves, that's going to make for a really messed up political system. But it would be interesting. It would be interesting to watch and follow and see what that does. I'm not sure what would happen. But what I do know is that it's looking more and more like what's happening in the Republican Party is what happened when Ross Perot joined in 1992. And that was that the division is what's going to force a different winner than they predict. Now, interestingly, I believe the same exact thing happened in 2016. You had Democrats who absolutely would not vote for Hillary Clinton. And so as the Democratic Party split and a lot of key strategizing about going to places like Mercer, Pennsylvania, or I heard of one today, Liberty, Indiana, or like these different places that are so small you barely know they exist, but they got key support there based on the Electoral College for Trump. And that was mathematically genius. The split of Democrats between Hillary and those who would never vote for her helped Donald Trump win in 2016. Now, was it a landslide? Obviously not. The popular vote went to Hillary, but the Electoral College was played very nicely by the Trump team. So that numbers game that we play, if you are interested in it, I encourage you to go to 538.com to listen to the 538 podcast, to listen to Pod Save America, Pod Save the World. And those are the big ones that I listen to. And that may sound like a bunch of liberal craziness, except that really what it is those are about numbers. And I'm a huge fan of looking at numbers, even though I think that they're almost meaningless. And maybe that's why I like looking at them or hearing about them. is because I find that when we sort of buck the system of the numbers, I'm generally happy to see that, whichever way that goes. If you're not a numbers person like me, who doesn't do numbers, just makes fun of numbers, um, well, then you're probably more interested in the way that people are talking about their government and about their candidates. And that we get mainly from qualitative studies like focus groups, which is I'm probably the most versed in, and studying their speeches, which of course is a rhetorical approach, and some surveys that are sort of open-ended surveys or one-on-one interviews. That's mostly what I'm interested in, is how people talk about or construct their position in or outside of the governmental system, in or outside of being a citizen. What does it mean to them? So that's my area of interest, whereas numbers may tell you something completely different. I just always like when the qualitative people are right. And that happens more often than not. You'd be surprised. Nonetheless, I do encourage you to read 538. I do encourage you to read the statistics and the numbers that come out. The polling is always fascinating and interesting that comes out. And make sure that you know how to read polls. And if you don't, please, by all means, in the Dear Professor section of our discussion board, put that up. I'd really like to hear about how to read a poll and how to evaluate it. And I promise you, I'll give you a little 10-minute spiel on that, and then you'll know better how to read them. I just don't want to assume that you all don't, or that you all do know how to read polls. So let me know how you feel about that. So this brings us up to, from 1992, we never do another three-party split for the presidential ticket again, but we do keep the town hall, what do I want to call that, format. The town hall format is still used. You probably understand it, recognize it, you've seen it. It's supposed to be more casual, more laid back. You're supposed to feel more connected. The questions are supposed to come from the general public. They don't. I mean, you can submit questions and they will decide which ones they want to ask. So we don't really have as much say over it as we probably would like to have, but at least there is some semblance of efficacy, a feeling of efficacy, or a feeling of being invited to the process, which is honestly kind of important. A lot of people who felt like, oh my gosh, I don't know enough to vote, or I don't have the information I need to vote, or well, tell me who to vote for. I hate it when people tell me that. They'll come up and they'll say, well, I don't know who to vote for. Tell me who to vote for. No. If nothing else, check out a couple of the pages from each person, each candidate, and just see what you like better. I mean, that's what this is supposed to be about, is about who individuals want and how that plays out numerically for the win. When it was set up in the late 1800s, the elections of the presidency, I say late 1800s because from the late 1700s to the late 1800s, there wasn't really a great system about how to appoint a president, of course, or to elect one even. A lot of the debate circled around the fact that Hamilton thought everybody was too dumb to vote. And you didn't just want everybody going out there and voting because there are too many uneducated people out there. And then you had other people arguing for, no, everyone should be allowed to vote. And he and Jefferson debated about whether or not it should be a federal system or whether it should be a state system. So there was a lot going on prior to the late 1800s. So really, it wasn't until the late 1800s or early 1900s that we got things settled into the way that they look now. And as some of you know, as of last year, women only had the right to vote for 100 years. So men had not been voting all that much as appointing each other. And you had to be a rich landowning white man to be involved in that. Obviously, from 1900 on, we've had much more involvement of minorities, of women, of candidates from different places, getting more people to vote, those efforts. Now, are there voter suppression efforts? That is something that we will talk about a different day. What we do know right now is in the 1900s, we saw the development of the better use of television, of radio, and then, of course, in 1996, the first web pages were used. And they were awful. I cannot explain to you how awful they were. This would have been Bob Dole, and 96 would have been Clinton. So you have Bob Dole and Bill Clinton trying to put up websites. It was horrifying, especially now as I think back on them. But then we had the internet become a lot more sophisticated is what word I'm trying to look for here. Sophisticated, and people's use of it became much more sophisticated. And so getting information really worked out well by utilizing the web specifically. And then in 2008, we have a major change again with the use of social media. Barack Obama, first one to really dig in and use social media to get sort of a grassroots campaign going on, where he was able, to fund his campaign almost completely on these small, minimal donations from many, many people. And it was the first time that the people really felt like, okay, we have participated in every part of this election. We've given money. I feel like I helped out in some way, even if it was $5. And so social media allowed the direct individual one-on-one feeling, that invitational rhetoric, to really work for Barack Obama. In 2012, we saw Barack Obama be, again, very good and win. Very good with social media. There were a lot of things going on at that point that were sort of, I would like to think superfluous to the campaigns. But other people will tell you, no, these are directly involved communication problems for McCain and Palin, and for Obama and Biden. How? What are some of those things? Because Barack Obama was already very adept at using social media to get to his audience. The McCain campaign was, I think, starting to get better at it. What are some of the extra things that happened, though? One is people started making videos. And I have deep questions about the ethics of this, but they started making videos that utilized Obama or utilized particularly Sarah Palin in these videos. They hypersexualized Palin. They talked about Barack Obama's background. I mean, you name it, it was up for grabs, because anybody could make that video and put it up on the internet. And people were now hip to that. And Twitter wasn't really that big yet either, believe it or not. We're mainly talking about YouTube and a little bit of Facebook. Okay. So what happened superfluously as well is, aside from those little entertaining videos, and some of them were entertaining. I mean, somebody took the Barbie Girl song and did a parody with Sarah Palin in it. And while that's entertaining, it certainly wasn't politically good communication on anybody's part. And I mean, I'm not a fan of it, but if it was just pure entertainment value, sure. The other thing that happened was just the announcement of Sarah Palin as McCain's partner. Because, I mean, it's sometimes good when nobody knows who your candidate is, the history of them. And sometimes that's not so good. And this was one of those times when that was not working for them. The more they found out as they went, the less they realized that she should be in the vice presidency. So the same thing happened with Jack Kemp. Many moons ago, before you guys were born, probably before your parents were married. I was in college, so it was a long time ago. So it has happened before where there's sort of these outside influences that make it difficult for us to truly understand what impact social media had on that particular campaign. And I have difficulty figuring that out. So that leads us up to today, where, as you all know, you can donate online, you can find anything online, you can create your own things, you can pop it out at Twitter. I'm sorry, Twitter is a cesspool. It is toxic. I have seen some stuff on there. I think I'm just going to have to give up my Twitter handle. I cannot handle it, literally. I have a Twitter handle for Dudashisms as well, because people used to like to grab quotes from my classroom and throw them up there on Twitter, and it was funny and it was cute, and that's fine. That's still funny and cute, but people are really horrible. And I knew that that was the case when I got on it, but many, many years ago. But it's gotten worse almost. And so when we talk about divisive language in our government, what we're really talking about is divisive language across voters and elected officials and campaign candidates. It's everybody. Now, I know that you all are thinking, of course, I mean, we already know all this. And I don't know whether to encourage you to not use these things, to find a different way to use them, that we should all be nice to each other, that we have a civic duty to be civil to each other. None of these things seem to work, so I'm not really sure what we're supposed to do if we're not going to dive into the cesspool ourselves when we run political campaigns. However, I have seen a really good campaign this year that answers that vitriol and that horribleness with things that are funny and factual and, honestly kind of critical, but not in an insulting way. So that I don't think anybody who knows me would be surprised to hear that campaign is in Pennsylvania. And it is the campaign for Senate between Dr. Oz and John Fetterman. Now, being from Pennsylvania was so long ago. I think John Fetterman and I are about the same age. He might be slightly older, but he was the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Pittsburgh. And it's sort of a well-known city for having really good participation and being a great community. We heard about it when I was younger. I grew up on the other side of Pittsburgh. So I've always been interested in his campaign because he became lieutenant governor, and I was like, what the hell did you guys do? Who did you elect? This guy looks like a lumberjack or maybe an automotive mechanic. He doesn't look like a lieutenant governor. And my mother was saying, oh yeah, but he was a really good mayor. And then as lieutenant governor, to be honest with you, he was fantastic. Not that I study lieutenant governors too often, but I do sometimes hear a lot about what's going on in Pennsylvania because my entire family is still there. So I'll hear a lot from them about, oh, did you see what our lieutenant governor did? And he's kind of a fun, wacky guy, huge Steelers fan, which any of you who know me know that I'm also a Steelers fan. But aren't we all who are from the area? I think if you live in Pittsburgh for like even a year, you come out and you have to be a Steeler fan. I don't know. But most of us who were raised in that area, we love our sports. We love our beer. And in this case, we actually really, really like our mayor and our lieutenant governor. And now he's running for the Senate, the United States Senate. John Fetterman is not your average looking politician. I'm not sure how I feel about a guy with a giant goatee and tattoos all over his body and dresses sort of in sweatpants and sweatshirts to go see his citizens. But it's refreshing. But here's what I think he does well. So for those of you who don't know, the state of Pennsylvania is really divided between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. No, that's not true at all. I mean, I would love to give Philadelphia away. But the truth of the matter is that there are 3 liberal areas in Pennsylvania. That is Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Scranton. Those 3, if you didn't know, our president was born there. So So these three carry the state Democrat, or they lose the state Republican. In 2008, my county went from a deep dark blue to bright freaking blood red overnight, it felt like. Mainly because I guess we have a bunch of bigots living there. I'm not really sure what exactly happened, but I know a lot of people flipped from Democrat to Republican. And that wasn't the only county that happened in. It was the starkest, but Pennsylvania went Republican, in which, what happened? How did that happen? But those three cities tend to keep Pennsylvania in the blue. It tends to be more blue because of that. Now, in 2008, when it started turning red, I think a lot of Democrats got nervous about that, and they started fighting back to gain ground, and they did. So it went blue ultimately. Now, those three cities, are the three cities that a president has to win, but they're also the three cities that a Senate candidate would have to win, or a governor would have to win. So it's hard sometimes to reach not just those three cities, but also, the Dutch country in between, the farmland in between, the people, the truckers up in the north part of Pennsylvania, close to Buffalo. New York, we've got a really diverse population, the same way a lot of states do. We've got, our cities that are really concentrated. And then you've got some small towns in between. But the rest of it is still farmland and very, very rural. I like it. I think that's why I like living in Missouri. It's very similar. So it's hard to get to all of those people. What's even harder is money. When money starts flowing in to one side or another, you can almost predict that the side with the most money is going to win. All right, so what do we have here? We have John Fetterman, born and raised in Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania, mayor of Braddock, just outside of Pittsburgh, huge Steelers fan, does crazy things sometimes like, his tattoos are all meaningful. His tattoos include the zip code of Braddock. It includes the names of everyone who was lost from his I don't know if it's from Allegheny County or from Braddock, who was lost in 9/11, who was lost in some of the police battles that were had there. I mean, he's got really meaningful tattoos. Fantastic. I don't have a problem with tattoos, but it is a little bit weird to see this guy with this long goatee. Again, no problem with goatees. And these tattoos all over him, walking in and saying, I'm running for Senate. But I like it, because he's also very down to earth, and wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt might not scream credibility when you go to Washington, D.C. But this man also has a lot of suits and ties. He knows when to dress the way he's supposed to for the audience that he's trying to reach. Cicero was a huge fan of this. He used to talk about what kind of toga you should wear if you were going to give a certain speech in a certain space. I mean, they were very, very touchy about dress codes. The reason why I say this is because Pittsburgh is still considered a blue-collar, hardworking steel town, which is fascinating because we don't make steel, and we haven't for like 40 years, but people still call us that, which is fine. There are a lot of railroads, a lot of like iron mills, fracking mills. So yes, it's still fairly blue collar, but it's also really renaissanced into an informational service industry. It's considered one of the greenest cities now. But when you go and talk to the people, they still have a blue collar sensibility, meaning that they still like getting their hands dirty, hard work. They have a great respect for a work ethic. They do not have a whole hell of a lot of respect for people who show up in a tie and a suit to go to a Steeler bar to watch the game. That will not fly. If they're meeting you at the local fire station, which is a place that we hold a lot of political events, and you walk in a suit and a tie and fancy shiny shoes, they're going to be like, what the hell? Get out of here. we don't want to talk to you, right? There's no credibility in that. Even though you look nice, you look the part of a senator, there's no credibility for Pittsburghers in that. Philadelphia, same way. Now, Philadelphia is slightly more sophisticated, so you might find more suit and tie and less blue collar. And then in the middle, you're going to find your farmers. You're going to find truly people working the land. So it's important that you know your audience, and John Fetterman seems to know your audience. The second thing I really, really like about Fetterman is that he does not respond to negative advertising or negative messaging the same way as every other politician out there. That is to say, he doesn't respond necessarily with negative advertising or messaging. I know this because if you follow the man on Twitter or anything else, he is hilarious, or his team is hilarious. He is. He's actually very funny in person, but his team is very, very good. They're very down to earth. The third thing that's going to work, I think, for John Fetterman and keeping Pennsylvania Senate's blue, or turning it blue, is this. His opponent, Dr. Oz. Okay, first of all, I don't know his full name. Is it Dr. Mehmet Oz? Or is it Osborne? Or is there another full name? Or is it just Dr. Oz? I don't know. I know nothing about that. What I do know is that Dr. Oz has had to testify in front of Congress before to defend some of the snake oil stuff that he was selling. And while I also was a big fan of his in the beginning when he first started talking about how to live a healthier lifestyle, it was when he started selling pills or supplements and all that crap that I just went, this is nuts. And he's been known to give incorrect medical advice on television. And he went to Congress and had to sort of defend that position at one point. And he has, I believe it's 8 houses. 2 of them or 3 of them are in Turkey. And he's got a New York penthouse, an LA penthouse. And then he has a place in New Jersey, because if you're going to settle down and work mostly in New York, you might as well live in Jersey. It's a little bit easier to find a home there that's good for a family. It's also like a minuscule amount cheaper than living in New York. And then a few years ago, he bought, and this is the way it's described to me, a palatial estate in Pennsylvania in the far eastern corner. Pretty much almost in Jersey. Almost in Jersey. Not quite, but almost in Jersey. And he did that specifically so that he would run for Senate here against John Fetterman. And everybody might think, well, he's got all the money and he's got all the credibility and he's a doctor and he's a television show guy. You might think that, and that would make it really hard for a person like John Fetterman to run against. However, to say that Dr. Oz does not understand Pennsylvanians is not just a tagline I'm throwing out there. I mean, literally everything that John Fetterman does well, Dr. Oz does the opposite. It's just horrible. In addition, there was, I believe, a 4-month period over the summer when John Fetterman had a stroke and was in the hospital and literally was not on the campaign trail. I never noticed. The reason I never noticed was because I was following his Twitter page, his Facebook. I was donating. I was, heavily involved in his social media, and his social media team just kept rolling with it. Nobody was saying anything like he's, had a major stroke. We'll be back in 4 months. I mean, nothing like that. So I didn't realize he was missing. And during that time, Dr. Oz did nothing. He didn't do any campaigning, good, bad, or otherwise, negative, positive, nothing. And that would have been a time to take real advantage and to go out and see people and talk to people, but he didn't do it. And then when people pointed this out to him, hey, John Fetterman's back, he's campaigning again, you need to campaign again. And somebody was like, well, wait a minute, you should have been campaigning this whole time. And this dude had a stroke and he's back and he looks great and he's working really hard and he's admitting that he has a speech difficulty and he's working on it. And his doctors say he's going to be just fine. You should take advantage of that. And apparently Dr. Oz decided the best way to do that was to go out and say, hey, John, what have you ever done for Pennsylvanians here? And then said something about, um, this guy can't even form a sentence from his stroke. Well, why would you want to elect him? I mean, it was brutal. And John Fetterman came back with some really good responses. Things like, I don't know, Dr. Oz, what have I done for Pennsylvanians? And then he would list like all the stuff he's done for Pennsylvanians, including, by the way, he refused to live at the lieutenant governor's mansion in Harrisburg. And what he did was he shut that down so it didn't cost the taxpayers anything. And then in the summertime, he opened the pool at the mansion and made that available to Pennsylvanians in New York or in Harrisburg who needed a place to go swimming. I mean, come on, that's just like basic stuff that you could do. Things that we would expect a good blue collar Pittsburgher or Pennsylvanian to do. And I don't think that Dr. Oz can say anything like that. In fact, they were looking at, does he even live in Pennsylvania? And it seems like maybe he should be disqualified, but there's no qualification for how long you have to live in Pennsylvania before you can run for Senate. So this guy is incredibly out of touch, and nothing has thrilled me more than the debate about crudité. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you may not have been paying attention to the late night talk shows or anything, but Dr. Oz decided to go into a store. He misnamed the store. He didn't even know what grocery store he was in. He said he was there to buy crudité for his wife. She wanted crudité. And he was there to buy it. He's picking up broccoli and talking about how expensive it is, and asparagus and how expensive it is, trying to relate to the common citizen in Pennsylvania. And we're all watching this like, dude, what's wrong with you? And apparently, I did not know this, but apparently in Pennsylvania, they don't know what crudité is. I do, only because I've been experienced in a lot of different places. Most people in Pennsylvania, like, if they're there in Pennsylvania, that's just not a term they use. So John Fetterman put out this really great messaging about, hey, Dr. Oz, in Pennsylvania, we call that a veggie plate. You might want to learn to say veggie plate, because that's all crudité is. And so there's like little things like that Fetterman's been able to pick up on that are sort of a criticism, but are and a little bit playful. When it comes to policy and understanding the policy or the legislative interests of Pennsylvania, I think that John Fetterman is just kicking Oz's ass on that. Now, the last poll I saw showed Fetterman up by 8%, which is just a lot, and it shouldn't be happening. In traditional political communication studies, it should not be happening, but he has done a really good job of crafting those messages. So what I'm going to do is I am going to put on Blackboard a link to this crudité veggie plate discussion. I'm going to find something that encapsulates that for you. So in case you aren't privy to it, you'll see it and know what I'm talking about. For you all, for the rest of this week, aside from listening to this, I will be posting onto Blackboard an article for you to read, and I will be posting that video, and I will also be posting a Blackboard discussion item for the week because I missed last week. And the Blackboard discussion post this week is going to be about recent events, current events, and I think I'm going to always be doing that. So that's how you can sort of prepare for that. And you'll always have a week to do them. So no matter what day I put them up, you'll have it till the next week on that day to do them. And I hope that is useful to you all and helpful. And in the meantime, thank you for letting me pontificate about the history of political communication and John Fetterman. That campaign is killing me. I think anytime you have Dr. Oz involved in anything, it's entertaining, if nothing else, right? So good things to look out for. I think that you'll enjoy the reading, and I think that you'll enjoy finding this video. And as always, if you have any questions or you want to put up an idea for a lecture or for a reading, or you have a question about what's going on right now in politics, please feel free to put those up on the Dear Professor section of the discussion board. I am not a lawyer, so I will not be able to answer those questions all the time, but I can talk about the rhetoric surrounding, the Dobbs decision, what's going on with Mar-a-Lago, what a classified document qualifies as. But I will be sharing with you what I have learned, not necessarily my own thoughts on that, because, again, I'm not a lawyer. Anyway, I'm looking forward to this semester. It's about to get real fun. So hang in there, and I'll be talking to you soon.